It all started with a mistake. A single voyage meant to find a shortcut to Asia ended up opening the door to an entirely different world. But behind the stories of gold, glory, and exotic lands lies a darker, harsher truth. Entire civilizations vanished. Continents were reshaped, and a new global order was born. For centuries, people have wondered, how did a small group of Europeans defeat powerful empires like the Aztecs and the Incas? How did a handful of ships reshape the future of two continents? And why did the conquest permanently change the world's balance of power? In this video, we're going to answer all these questions. So let's start. The story begins in 1492, when Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, landed in the Caribbean. He thought he had reached the edges of Asia, not realizing he had stepped into a world that Europe didn't even know existed. But even more importantly, he claimed the land for Spain. That single act set off one of the most dramatic transformations in human history, what we now call the Spanish Conquest of the Americas. Spain was not yet the global powerhouse it would soon become, but it had two things that made conquest possible: ambition and belief. The Spanish crown wanted wealth, trade, and influence to compete with Portugal, and the Catholic Church wanted to spread Christianity to new lands. Together, they created an unstoppable mission: expand, conquer, convert, and control. Soon, Spanish explorers known as conquistadors began sailing west, and among them was one of history's most controversial figures, Hernán Cortés. In 1519, Cortés landed on the shores of Mexico with a few hundred men, a handful of horses, and a burning desire for glory. Before him stood one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the time, the Aztec Empire, ruled by Emperor Moctezuma II from the great city of Tenochtitlan, a city more advanced than anything Cortés had ever seen. So how did a few hundred Spaniards defeat an empire of millions? It wasn't just weapons. It wasn't just strategy. It was a combination of events that changed the course of history. First came alliances. Cortés understood something crucial. The Aztec Empire had many enemies. The Tlaxcalans, for example, had long suffered under Aztec rule. Cortés promised them freedom in exchange for support. Suddenly, the Spanish army grew not by hundreds, but by tens of thousands. This alliance was one of the most decisive factors in the fall of the Aztecs. Second came technology. Spanish steel swords, cannons, and horses created fear and confusion. But while weapons helped, they didn't guarantee victory. What truly shifted the balance was something invisible: disease. Smallpox, brought unknowingly by Europeans, spread across the Americas with catastrophic speed. The Aztecs had no immunity. Entire cities were wiped out, leaders died, armies collapsed. By the time the Spanish marched on Tenochtitlan for the final assault in 1521, the empire was already weakened beyond repair. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked a turning point. Spain now had control over Mexico, one of the richest regions in the Americas. But the conquest did not end there. Far to the south, another empire was about to face the same fate. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro confronted the mighty Inca Empire in the Andes. The Incas were powerful, organized, and resourceful, but they were in the middle of a civil war. Two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, were fighting for the throne. Pizarro used this chaos to his advantage. At Cajamarca, he captured Atahualpa in a surprise attack without losing a single Spanish soldier. The emperor tried to buy his freedom with the largest ransom in history, rooms filled with gold and silver. The Spanish accepted the wealth and executed him anyway. Just like in Mexico, alliances, technology, and disease broke the backbone of the Inca Empire. Entire regions fell one by one. By the late 1530s, Spain controlled Peru, one of the richest sources of silver the world had ever seen. And this is where the story becomes even bigger than conquest. Because what happened next didn't just affect the Americas, it reshaped the world. From the mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, mountains of silver flowed into the Spanish Empire. That silver paid for armies, built cities, fueled global trade, and turned Spain into the first true world superpower. This is the beginning of what historians call the first global economy connecting Europe, the Americas, Africa, in Asia through trade, forced labor, migration, and empire. But wealth came with a terrible cost. The indigenous populations faced forced conversions, harsh labor systems, and cultural destruction. Millions died not only from disease, but from the brutality of colonial rule. Entire civilizations, the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, and hundreds of smaller cultures were transformed forever. Yet, the Spanish conquest also created something completely new. A world where European, indigenous, and African cultures mixed and overlapped. A world where languages, religions, foods, and identities blended to create new nations. The Americas as we know them today, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Argentina, and many more were shaped by this collision of worlds. But the transformation didn't stop there. Spain's rise changed the balance of power in Europe. It triggered rivalries, wars, and a race among other European powers to colonize the Americas. And the wealth extracted from the New World helped fuel the rise of capitalism, the growth of global trade networks, and the birth of modern nation-states. The Spanish conquest didn't just reshape continents, it reshaped history itself. The conquest also sparked massive social changes. Spanish colonial administrators implemented the encomienda system, granting settlers the right to extract labor and tribute from indigenous populations. While it was intended to organize and control the territories, it also entrenched exploitation, forcing native people into grueling labor in mines and plantations. The silver and gold extracted from the Americas flowed to Europe, enriching Spain and transforming global trade, but the human cost was staggering. Indigenous populations across Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean declined dramatically. Some estimates suggest a decline of up to 90% in certain regions within a century, largely due to disease, forced labor, and warfare. Religion played a central role in the conquest. Catholic missionaries accompanied Spanish armies with a mission to convert native populations. Churches and missions were established in every new settlement, aiming to replace indigenous belief systems. While some communities resisted, others adapted or blended their traditions with Christianity, creating a new cultural and religious identity that persists to this day. This cultural transformation was not just spiritual, it was a tool of governance. By converting local populations, the Spanish were able to exercise social control, integrate indigenous elites into colonial administration, and create a sense of order in newly conquered territories. Spain's domination of the Americas also reshaped global politics. The enormous wealth from the colonies allowed Spain to finance wars in Europe, influence dynastic politics, and compete with other emerging powers such as France, England, and the Netherlands. The strategic ports, trade routes, and colonies became critical nodes in the growing network of global commerce. The Americas became the cornerstone of Spain's empire, connecting the old world to the new, and shaping the trajectory of global geopolitics for centuries. This connection between conquest, commerce, and imperial power demonstrated how control over one continent could determine the balance of power across the globe. However, the Spanish conquest also had long-term consequences that went far beyond economics and politics. Entire societies were disrupted, traditions, languages, and governance systems were dismantled or altered. Indigenous knowledge systems, architecture, and science were often suppressed, but elements persisted in hybrid forms. For example, agricultural practices, medicinal knowledge, and art forms merged with European ideas to create entirely new cultural landscapes. The fusion of indigenous, European, and African cultures led to the birth of vibrant civilizations in the Americas, but always under the shadow of conquest and colonization. The conquest also ignited a chain reaction of imperialism. Seeing Spain's immense wealth and power, other European nations sought to establish colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. England, France, Portugal, and the Netherlands followed, sparking centuries of colonization and conflict that reshaped the world order. This global competition for colonies would eventually lead to wars, revolutions, and the redrawing of maps across continents. The Spanish conquest, therefore, was not just about subjugating indigenous empires, it was the first step in creating a truly interconnected world driven by empire, trade, and global power struggles. It's important to note that resistance was never absent. Indigenous groups continuously resisted Spanish rule, sometimes through open rebellion, guerrilla warfare, or cultural preservation. Leaders such as Tupac Amaru in Peru and Mixten rebels in Mexico exemplified courage and defiance, refusing to accept subjugation quietly. While the Spanish military and political systems were overwhelmingly powerful, resistance forced the colonizers to adapt and sometimes negotiate, shaping the way Spanish rule was implemented. This tension between conquest and resistance defined much of the colonial experience, and its echoes can be felt in modern movements for indigenous rights and cultural recognition. By the 1600s, Spain had firmly established its rule over much of the Americas, but the conquest had also permanently altered the trajectory of world history. The wealth extracted from the New World financed European armies, empowered monarchies, and shifted the global balance of power. Trade networks spanning the Atlantic connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas, initiating the first truly global economic system. The mixing of cultures, people, and ideas set the stage for modern nations in the Americas and laid the foundations for centuries of globalization. In essence, a small group of Spanish explorers had initiated a process that reshaped continents, economies, and human societies on a scale that few could have imagined. The Spanish conquest of the Americas also teaches a profound lesson about the intersection of ambition, technology, disease, and human will. European weapons, horses, and military organization gave the conquistadors an advantage, but the collapse of empires like the Aztecs and Incas was not inevitable. Internal divisions, rivalries, and the devastating impact of disease all contributed to the outcome. The conquest illustrates how global history can hinge on multiple factors, interacting in unpredictable ways. A single event can trigger far-reaching consequences that last centuries. Even today, the legacy of the Spanish conquest shapes the Americas. The languages, religions, and political systems of Latin America trace their roots to this period. Cities like Mexico City, Lima, and Bogotá were founded on the ruins of powerful indigenous capitals. The extraction of wealth and forced labor created social hierarchies that influenced economic patterns for generations. Cultural fusion produced vibrant art, music, and traditions that define Latin American identity. And the history of conquest continues to inform debates about colonialism, indigenous rights, and global power structures. In conclusion, the Spanish conquest of the Americas was more than a story of explorers and empires. It was a turning point that reshaped continents, transformed civilizations, and altered the course of world history. It combined ambition, technology, alliances, and disease in ways that allowed a small European power to dominate vast, sophisticated civilizations. It created new nations, new economies, and new cultural landscapes, while also leaving a legacy of tragedy, resilience, and transformation. Understanding the conquest helps us grasp how Europe's expansion created a new global order and why the Americas are the way they are. Today, a world born from collision, conquest, and the unstoppable drive for power and wealth.